Hi, this is going to be the first video in a short series of videos on schizophrenia and psychosis. So I'm going to start by saying that schizophrenia is probably the most severe psychiatric illness. And when I say severe, that's a little complicated because, of course, you can have somebody with schizophrenia who's doing fine on medication, working, going to school, whatever, having a family. And you can have somebody with depression who is suicidal, right? So severity is a little confusing. But in terms of the most significant and globally affecting, in terms of globally affecting the person, schizophrenia is probably the most severe that we have. So for diagnosis of schizophrenia, we have to see psychosis in the person. And psychosis is a departure from reality or an inability to distinguish what is going on inside my mind and what is going on outside my mind. So kind of hard to tell maybe the difference between the two. Psychosis manifests in typically three different ways: hallucinations, delusions, and severely disorganized thought, behavior, or speech. So hallucinations, we're talking about the sensory part of the mind, all of our five senses. Delusions, we're talking about thoughts and beliefs. And severely disorganized thought, behavior, or speech, we're typically talking about behavior and what we can see of thought and speech. It doesn't have to be all of these. We're talking about one of these meets the diagnostic criteria for psychosis. And again, for a diagnosis of schizophrenia, you have to have psychosis. So let's talk a little bit about hallucinations. We can have hallucinations in any of the five senses. Hallucinations are, they're inaccurate understanding of our sensory input. So typically we feel like we have sensory input and we really don't. So a person can hear, see, smell, taste, or have a sense of feeling something that is not being created by the outside world, but in their own head or in their own mind. And auditory hallucinations are in the realm of hearing, and typically that's when people hear voices. Hearing voices is the most common type of hallucination. Visual hallucinations are a little less common, but they're also not uncommon. So probably 30 to 40% of people with severe mental illness, like schizophrenia, have visual hallucinations. Tactile, olfactory, and gustatory are much lower in percentages of people with mental illness who experience them. People who have tactile hallucinations, often that might be a feeling of bugs on the skin, or you're going to see a video where a woman feels like the devil is sitting on her shoulder. They're a sense of touch. Sometimes you have tactile hallucinations when people are coming off of drugs or alcohol and they feel like there are bugs crawling under their skin. Olfactory hallucinations are when people smell things that aren't there. Those are quite rare. Under 10% of the population of people who have mental illness experience olfactory hallucinations. And just as a brief warning, and we'll talk about this later in the course, if somebody's having olfactory hallucinations, they're smelling things that aren't there, that requires a medical checkup because it often is a sign of either seizures or a tumor or some kind of organic brain problem. It could be dementia. So that needs to be looked at. And gustatory is similar, also very rare, often related to olfactory. I put these in the order of most to least common for people with mental illnesses. And we're going through this pretty quickly. Delusions are false beliefs that are maintained despite all evidence to the contrary. So all of us have false beliefs, and all of us are wrong about a lot of things. Sometimes we can be convinced or shown evidence that we're wrong, and then we change our mind. So I might think that, I don't know, the coronavirus is a hoax, for example. And then I'm presented with evidence that people are dying, or people are very sick, or hospitals are overwhelmed, whatever it is. And then I say, oh, well, sorry, I made a mistake. That is real. That's not a delusion. That's simply a mistake. With a delusion, basically, if you could talk the person out of it, it wasn't a delusion to start with. You can't talk people out of delusions. Typically, we break delusions down into bizarre and non-bizarre. Non-bizarre delusions are realistically possible, but they did not happen. So, for example, I might believe that I'm married to the president. It's physically possible. I mean, people get married, so it's physically possible that this could happen, but it didn't. I'm absolutely wrong, and there's nothing that you can do to convince me that I am wrong. A bizarre delusion is something that couldn't possibly happen. So, for example, the TV is broadcasting my thoughts to the world, or people on the television are referring to me in the news by coding, things like that. The reason that we talk about bizarre and non-bizarre delusions is typically is to understand severity. So bizarre delusions tend to be around disease that is more severe than non-bizarre delusions. So somebody who has bizarre delusions, we would say that their mental illness might be more severe than somebody with non-bizarre delusions. Not to say that non-bizarre delusions are not mental illness. They are. So I want to stop and kind of stop here from talking about the signs and symptoms of schizophrenia and talk about how important it is to remember that we're all on a spectrum here. None of us is completely free of mental illness. None of us are all on or off. We all have odd experiences and beliefs. There's speculation that about 20% of people hear voices, but they don't talk about it because they're afraid of being perceived or labeled as crazy. So it's important to remember. And we all hear voices to a certain extent. For example, there's, a lot of us have a critical voice in our mind. That's really common. I'll tell you, my mother died over 30 years ago. And in my mind, when I get dressed in the morning, so I have to say, first of all, she was a really beautiful woman and she dressed really well. Me, on the other hand, I prefer to hang out in my day pajamas whenever I can, And if I put on lipstick for Zoom, it's like, wow, that's a big step for me. So when I get dressed in the morning and, I look in the mirror, let's say I'm going to work and I look in the mirror, I can hear her voice in my head saying, really? You're going to wear that, huh? So now, I know that my actual dead mother is not talking to me, but there's a way in which I've internalized her voice and it lives in my head. And it feels like it is her voice and not mine, if that makes sense. So that would not be psychosis. I know that it's in my head, even though it feels like her voice, and it's a voice. And it can affect me emotionally. That voice, or any kind of critical voice in my head, it can affect me emotionally. And that's important. And delusions are also on a spectrum. For example, we talked about, thought broadcasting, which is quite unusual and quite severe. So my thoughts are being broadcast on the media. Or we can have delusional jealousy. And, everybody experiences jealousy to some extent, right? At what point does it become delusional? That is certainly on a spectrum, right? So we'll talk about that in the next video.